demanding to know how a team with days of preparation could come out so unprepared, so undisciplined, and so lost. Fans refused to accept simple excuses. The blame couldn't just fall on players. It couldn't just fall on referees. It had to fall on the person tasked with leading them. Caitlin Clark may be the star, but leadership starts at the top. And in this game, it crumbled. The fallout from that disastrous quarter is still being felt. Fans are calling for change. Analysts are writing scathing critiques. And in the middle of it all is Caitlin Clark, forced to play peacemaker, leader, and superstar all at once. This isn't how it was supposed to be. She came to Indiana to elevate a franchise, but instead she's carrying it on her back while her coach drags it down. For Clark, the message is clear. The Fever cannot win like this. Unless drastic change happens, history will remember this collapse as a moment everything broke. Preparation is the foundation of playoff success, but Stephanie White arrived in Atlanta looking like she hadn't studied at all. The Dream had been the opponent for days, yet Indiana played as if they had been blindsided. Offensive sets were stagnant, defensive rotations collapsed, and players looked utterly confused about their roles. This wasn't bad luck, it was bad coaching. For Caitlin Clark, who has always prided herself on film study and preparation, the lack of direction was shocking. Fans asked the obvious question, how could a professional coach walk into the postseason without a game plan? When teams collapse, it's rarely about talent alone. It's about preparation. White had days to build strategies, yet Indiana looked like they hadn't practiced at all. Aaliyah Boston, their interior anchor, was parked at the three-point line as if she were a stretch forward. Natasha Howard was forced into mismatches that exposed her weaknesses, and role players had no idea where to be. For Clark, sitting on the bench or trying to orchestrate chaos on the floor, the message was devastating. Her team wasn't losing because they weren't good enough. They were losing because they weren't prepared. Playoff basketball exposes weaknesses ruthlessly. Atlanta was ready. They adjusted, they exploited mismatches, and they capitalized on Indiana's confusion. Meanwhile, the Fever had no counterpunch. Watching White on the sidelines, fans saw a coach more focused on officials than on her team. Every timeout felt wasted, every rotation more puzzling than the last. Clark could only do so much, but even her brilliance couldn't overcome systemic failure. Commentators said the Fever looked lost, and it wasn't hyperbole. They weren't just beaten on the scoreboard. They were beaten in preparation, execution, and leadership. The difference between the teams was night and day. It's one thing for a team to lose because of superior talent. It's another to lose because your coach never gave you a chance. Indiana fans who filled arenas all season to watch Caitlin Clark were furious. They didn't expect miracles, but they expected a plan. White's inability to provide one turned what could have been a competitive series into a humiliation. Clark herself, though diplomatic in public, couldn't hide her frustration. The weight of wasted potential hung heavy. And when a team feels abandoned by preparation, trust in the coach evaporates quickly. The phrase that kept echoing after the game was simple but damning: no game plan. Analysts, players, and fans repeated it like a mantra. Indiana weren't just outplayed, they were outprepared. And in the playoffs, that's unforgivable. Caitlin Clark's rise was supposed to signal a new era of Fever basketball, but instead her first postseason became a case study in how coaching incompetence destroys opportunity. White's defenders pointed to officiating, but excuses couldn't mask reality. Preparation wins in the postseason. Indiana had none. And now, with fans demanding accountability, the phrase "no game plan" has become White's legacy. Officiating became a lightning rod for Stephanie White. But instead of calming her team, she exploded. She blamed referees for disrupting rhythm, pointed at foul calls, and leaned on excuses. Great coaches know how to adjust. White didn't. Indiana sputtered every time foul trouble hit. And instead of shifting strategies, she doubled down on complaining. Clark's face told the story, a superstar forced to endure the chaos of a coach more obsessed with whistles than with solutions. Fans didn't buy it. They knew the difference between bad calls and bad leadership. The cameras caught a moment no one expected. Caitlin Clark, the rookie phenom, physically stepped in to hold back her own head coach, Stephanie White. This wasn't just a sideline flare-up. It was a symbol of a franchise in turmoil. Coaches are supposed to steady their players. But here, the roles were reversed. Fans watching live gasped, wondering how things had come to this point. For Clark, already under the heaviest spotlight in the WNBA, being thrust into the role of emotional leader over her own coach raised disturbing questions about leadership, control, and just how bad things had gotten. It wasn't a brief scuffle or harmless disagreement. Stephanie White completely lost her composure on the referees, screaming, gesturing, and ignoring her team's collapsing focus on the floor. The Indiana Fever were already struggling, but in that moment, their head coach made things worse. Clark, visibly frustrated but composed, restrained White like a veteran dealing with a volatile teammate. The optics were damning, the star rookie showing more maturity than the coach hired to guide her. That single snapshot spread like wildfire across social media, becoming a meme and a warning sign all at once. When your coach needs to be saved from herself during a playoff game, it's not just bad optics, it's organizational chaos. Clark didn't want to be the one doing damage control, but she had no choice. The Fever were unraveling on the court, and instead of providing solutions, White poured gasoline on the fire. The players weren't sure where to turn. Analysts later said this was the most blatant evidence yet that White had lost control of her team, her composure, and perhaps even her future as head coach. The locker room trust was hanging by a thread. What made this moment even more explosive was that it happened under the brightest lights of the postseason. This wasn't a meaningless regular season game. This was do-or-die basketball with millions watching Caitlin Clark's every move. And when the Fever desperately needed strategy, calm, and direction, their coach delivered a meltdown. Fans online didn't just call it embarrassing. They called it unforgivable. One fan tweeted, "If Caitlin Clark has to babysit her coach, what chance do the Fever have?" That sentiment echoed across the basketball world. For many, it was a last straw. The narrative that followed was unavoidable. Caitlin Clark demanding accountability. She might not have shouted it in the press conference, but her actions told the story. This wasn't the fiery passion of a coach standing up for her team. It was recklessness at the expense of her players. For Clark, who carried the weight of expectation on her shoulders all season, this was a moment she could no longer ignore the obvious. Stephanie White wasn't just struggling. She was sinking. And in Clark's eyes, if the Fever were going to win, leadership had to change immediately. The disaster didn't stop at White's outburst. The Fever entered the fourth quarter with the game still within reach. But what followed was a collapse of epic proportions. 2 turnovers and 2 technical fouls back-to-back destroyed any hope of a comeback. Instead of fighting, the Fever imploded under pressure. White's meltdown had infected the team, dragging them into chaos. Momentum is everything in the playoffs, and Indiana handed theirs away in one ugly sequence. The scoreboard reflected failure, but the real collapse was deeper. It was the unraveling of discipline, structure, and trust on the sideline. Coaches are judged by their ability to rally a team in the storm. Instead, White became the storm by losing her composure. She gave Atlanta free points and put her players in an impossible position. Clark, Boston, and Mitchell could only shake their heads as the deficit widened. It wasn't the referees. It wasn't bad luck. It was leadership failing at the most critical moment. The Fever needed answers, but all they got was chaos. For fans, this wasn't a bad break. It was proof that their coach wasn't ready for the moment, and might never be. Players often say basketball is a game of runs, and in the playoffs, those runs define legacies. The Fever's run in the fourth quarter, however, was infamous for all the wrong reasons. Instead of climbing back, they spiraled down, and White's technical foul was a dagger. By the time the Fever regained possession, their chance at momentum was gone. Analysts compared it to a boxer throwing in the towel mid-fight. Fans who tuned in to see Caitlin Clark's magic instead watched her team disintegrate, not because of talent, but because their coach couldn't control herself when it mattered most.